Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Nightlight. This is going to be another show that raises IQs to a very healthy level. A persistent fan favorite is the Shakespeare Authorship Controversy. We've done many shows on the topic and had a variety of points of view presented. Our guest tonight is Dr. Earl Showerman. He is a real emergency room doctor, and he has also provided beneficial medical advice over the phone as well. That's another story, but it's working. Earl and Catherine Children have been guests promoting last year's Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference, and then to be published books a few months later, and it is out. It's a terrific book. And here it is. Shakespeare's Greater Greek. Let's see what else. And he is also in the Oxfordian number 25. A little bit of a preview of the book. Let's see what else. So instead of looking at the lack of documentation of, the Globe Theater's receipts of paying Shakespeare for writing the plays, Earl is looking at the library resources available to Edward de Vere, and this is going to be a fascinating aspect of tonight's discussion. So let's bring on Earl.
Hey, Mark.
There he is. Hey, Earl. How you doing?
Very well this evening, and happy to be with you and your audiences. So, and appreciate the invitation and the pitch for the book that just came out just a month ago today.
Yeah. I think the audience is really going to enjoy tonight's show. And okay, so the title of your book, Shakespeare's Greater Greek, is the opposite of what is in the first folio, and I'm sure many of our listeners remember you and Catherine talking about, the first folio has all kinds of misleading information in it, but we have I have to stand up for this, and okay, there's the title page. This might be new since we haven't had you on since we switched over to the video. But here's one of the blank pages right here. Why are there so many blank pages in just a 15-page document? There's like, what, 5 blank pages? Kind of suspicious about. It could fill up a little bit of biographical material, the author there, but they opted not to do that. Anyhow, in the introductory poem by contemporary playwright Ben Jonson, here's the line that you are doing the opposite of. You are the original text reads, "And though thou hadst small Latin and less Greek." Okay, so it kind of sounds like.
And then he goes on to say, but to honor thee, I would call forth thundering Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, him of Cordoba born, and Aeacus and Pacuvius, who are great Latin tragedians also, to hear thy buskin tread the boards. So he says, although you had very little, but I would call forth the greatest of the classical playwrights to hear your words, because you are as good as they are, or better. So he does kind of twist it a little bit, but he is referring perhaps to the fact that the gentleman from Stratford, to whom the attribution has traditionally gone, was probably not schooled in Greek at all. And if he did, it would have been rudimentary Greek, perhaps biblical Greek, and that the plays that are referenced of the Greek, masters of the 3 great tragedians and Aristophanes also were largely unpublished in England. They were not translated into English. There were a handful of Latin translations that were available. Private libraries had some collections, like Lord Burleigh had Greek editions in his library. Thomas Smith, both of whom had connections to the Earl of Oxford, of course, had personal collections that included the Greek tragedies and comedies. So we do know that in the elite educated circles, Greek was well known and deeply appreciated, and the renewal of serious theater after 2,000 years, reflecting on the Greek model, was a dramatic and impressive revolutionary moment in English history. And a handful of people really recognized the root of it came from those ancient Greek authors. Although Johnson's comment, again, seems to suggest that you didn't have it. So we'll stick to the Renaissance sources and maybe some of those Latin sources, because your foreign languages weren't very good. And yet we know that Shakespeare used primary sources that were only published in Italian or French. And so where did he learn all the Romance languages? He probably studied Latin at school, if he did attend, and it seems probable he did. We don't have any evidence that he didn't or did. So it's a great conundrum. But the fact that Greek was so revolutionary and important in the higher ranking circles, that they were all studying Greek, and there were renewal of interest in this that was coming as part of the Renaissance and the Reformation.
Okay, so you're saying that Shakespeare was more influenced by Greek drama than previously thought, but you also note that prior to the last 100 years, actually a lot of the Victorian era authors were pretty very much aware that Shakespeare, or the author of the plays, was very much aware of Greek drama, and even on pages 16 through 17, right? This discounting of Attic dramatic influence was reinforced again more recently in Shakespeare and the Classics from 2004, an essay collection edited by Charles Martindale and A.B. Taylor. So, there's, I don't need to.
Where the conspiracy, Mark, lies, and you've identified it perfectly, that early scholars, Victorian scholars, people who are well educated in the classics, which were taught at the universities, so we have highly educated independent scholars that are investigating things such as Shakespeare's use of his medical knowledge or his legal knowledge, and of course his knowledge of the Greek tragedies attracted certain scholars who were very familiar with the Greek tragedies and knew the stories and saw the parallels in certain specific plays such as The Winter's Tale and Hamlet and others. And yet, turn of the century, 1904, Robert Root writes a book about Shakespeare in the Classics, and he says, no way does he ever refer to anything, any event in Greek literary resources that he wouldn't have had access to them. So we're just going to ignore them. And that became orthodoxy, really, for virtually a whole century. They didn't want to look at it. And the reason, probably after 1920, was that the Earl of Oxford was the primary new candidate as an alternative to the traditional attribution. And he was highly educated in a lot of languages. Certainly, we know Latin and French. And we have no problem surmising that he knew Greek. And in fact, very recent research has confirmed that he could read ancient Greek and he could actually write in ancient Greek characters. And so his knowledge of languages was stunning. And that's really where the whole authorship challenge has come from, which has to do with the fact that Shakespeare was really, I don't know of any other author that is as self-consciously literate as Shakespeare. That is to say, of the 37, 38, 39 plays that to whom we can attribute his contribution, there are over 200 books or other articles, tracts, passages from the Bible, whatever, that are cited. So that is to say, he was very widely read, and when he put a play together, he peppered these plays, he seasoned them with classical allusions, with other historical references. Also, that was his cleverness, and that was the core of the mimetic art that the Renaissance was fostering. They honored the historical sources. They loved to know what the original poets were writing and playwrights, and then weaving their themes and some of their dramaturgy and their plots and characterizations into their own work, added to the literary subtlety and brilliance of the work. So no one did it better than Shakespeare. But it was a time after 2,000 years of no realistic drama in which it was born in 30 or 40 years from the 1570s, 80s, right on through the first decade of the 17th century. So you have a very narrow period of intense creativity, and it was fostered somewhat by definitely access to rare texts and Greek and other Latin translations of the plays of the original great ones of the Attic Theater. And so that has been the bone I've picked for better part of 20 years. And every time I get a lead, I find more meat on that bone, and it has been like a golden thread that I can weave into a tapestry. Now, and that's what that book represents. I think 8 different plays that I was inspired to write a paper on, looking at the Greek sources that were attributed to them mainly by other scholars. I was merely following the leads that I could pick up from a century ago and expand on them when there was additional material that I thought was worthy of inclusion. So I've been very fortunate, Mark. I have had access to a wonderful library in the region that is connected to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and I've had a theater that inspired me to even begin this kind of work, so that I can see the living entity of the art on the stage, and then go back to the literature and say, oh my God, you take that and make this out of it. This is transformative and wonderful, and it changes people's lives, and it's pretty exciting. for me, who was never trained as a literary scholar until I retired about 20 years ago, and then started my reading and studying in earnest, it was a revelation and the best gift of retirement could ever give me, a series of investigations that went against authority and usually bore some kind of fruit. Most of the time, that fruit got published in some form or another.
I like how you get into, the mid-Victorians are writing about it, then the idea of the Greek influence kind of disappears for a while, and you're reviving it. You're making really good points that this topic should not have disappeared for over a century. You bring it back, and I think that's one of the things that Barbara and I try to do with a lot of the shows is give people a chance to make their points about aspects of history that we've forgotten about, or been misinterpreted, that need clarified. And as we get into more of the book tonight, I think you'll make that really clear that we need to have the Greek influence back into the forefront.
Well, acknowledged as very significant, as opposed to ignored or denied, which is mostly their strategy. And the most intelligent of them, Colin Burrow, professor, I think, still at Oxford, and Jonathan Bate, who's now at another university, but used to be at Oxford also, in their books, they say, no, there was a surrogate, that Shakespeare learned of Greek drama from Ovid. That is Bates' point, or that he learned it from, Plutarch, which is what other people have offered, that there's a surrogate intervening, that you learn about Greek drama by reading about secondary sources. Even if you could read the Greek, you would know less about it. That's ridiculous. That's Colin Burrow, a great professor and writes good books. But you could see how they dance around this. There's only really one serious, very serious scholar that has acknowledged the influence, certainly of Euripides, within the Shakespeare corpus and the other plays of the Renaissance. And that is Professor Tanya Pollard at Brooklyn College. Her book, Greek Tragic Heroines on Shakespearean Stages, Greek Tragic Women on Shakespearean Stages. It was an award-winning book. It was a phenomenal study of Euripidean influence on the stage. And, it was wonderful to see when I looked at the index that she actually cited several of the articles that I had written that were relevant to the whole question. And I think that Euripides is a case that can be made fairly easily because he was very popular. His Iphigenia, Aulis, his Medea, his Hecuba, they were all translated pretty early on and were fascinating of interest because they were more realistic in their representations than the earlier playwrights, Sophocles and Aeschylus. So he attracted more interest, and there's more cultural influence across the board. And Tanya Pollard and Laurie McGuire and others have made very good points about that. And Professor Pollard's index shows all the published editions of the Greek plays on the continent. So she went deep dive on this and concluded that definitely Euripidean influence was a powerful part of what gave Shakespeare certainly his vision of tragical women. There was no question that the Euripidean influence was there. When you read Euripides, you could see why that might be the case. Very strong women, very determined women. And his Alcestis is certainly recognized by a number of scholars, including Jonathan Bate, to be the source for the final scene of both The Winter's Tale and Much Ado About Nothing. So there's been a broader recognition in recent years, but ultimately a school of denial about the direct or significant or penetrating so-called influence of Shakespeare. Now, Wilson Knight, again, he says, that for the first time in 2,000 years, since Aeschylus, Euripides, the realistic drama of the Renaissance stage in England had that same feeling that to go from Aeschylus to Shakespeare was a very small step. They breathed the same air, and so there are theater professionals who recognize the tenor of the place and the magnificence of the drama in a way that serious drama was being reenacted for the first time in over 2,000 years. And yet he never really acknowledged that maybe Shakespeare was influenced by Greeks. But there were a handful that saw that Hamlet was definitely influenced by Aeschylus and probably also by Euripides and Sophocles' plays. That the story of Hamlet is parallel to the story of Orestes coming back to revenge the murder of his father by his murderer, and including matricide. So it was the parallels are there, and sometimes it's a little bit different. But Gilbert Murray, a great Greek scholar, perhaps the foremost English Greek scholar in the world during the first half of the 20th century, he wrote a pamphlet in 1914 about this, and it was just a obviously convincing case over and over again that there are deep parallels in a variety of ways: plot, characterization, images, stuff that goes on. And a handful of scholars have recognized that. But when you look at the Shakespeare editions, like your Riverside and mine, Norton Shakespeare, Arden editions, mostly they do not discuss the Greek sources. However, there are a handful that do, and there will be more in the future. So we're cracking a code of denial in what we're doing here. And I'm pleased to say that my colleagues like the book. They're happy and proud that I put it together. And perhaps there will be a broader audience who are interested in Shakespeare, interested in theater history, interested in the origins of what brought, such power to the stage in the English Renaissance.
I think a lot of people like
goes that way. Yeah,
I think a lot of people like just Elizabethan history too. So, and she's just remains a very popular political figure. Feminine power. There's all kinds of different ways to interpret her.
She studied Greek with Roger Ascham. She loved the classics. She spoke like 7 different languages. She was a brilliant polymath.
Yeah, she was very nurturing of all kinds of arts. Besides whoever if Edward de Vere was the real author, you also have Spencer at the same time. Yeah, so many of the people where we read their fantasy works or really good poetry, Sidney's works. She's somewhere probably behind it as helping to encourage arts for that time, and maybe one of the best examples of Elizabethan playwriting. Yeah, you do a great job in your book, and I'm sure a lot of tonight's viewers are familiar with the play as A Midsummer Night's Dream. And I think that might be a good way to kind of get into one of your examples with going back to Aristophanes The Birds.
Yes.
And, we'll get into the plants and animals as well, but I'll be quiet and let you take over and develop that.
Well, you're talking politics with Elizabeth, and of course, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Not very many editors will admit to this, but there's a bold allegory between Bottom and Titania paralleling the romance between the French Duc d'Alençon and Queen Elizabeth during almost a decade of courtship, in which letters are going back and forth, and he made 2 visits to England without a passport from his brother, the king, and courted her, and she played him right along. And then eventually, after this protracted misadventure on his part, is thinking the Protestant queen would marry him and allow him to practice his religion. And he finally left England, went as her agent to Brabant. He became the Duke of Brabant, and then led her forces and some French forces against the Spanish, but basically got thrown out of the Low Countries and died at the age of 29, a broken-hearted failure as a prince of the realm of France. And so many historians see this as a burlesque, almost, as not Midsummer Night's Dream, but their romance was a farce. And it was controlled completely by Elizabeth. It was to prevent France from forming an alliance with Spain. So you have united Catholic countries against the Protestant English. And, so they wanted to prevent an alliance between the Spaniards and the French. And so her willingness to negotiate to be part of this whole facade, ruse. Now, his ambassador, Jean Simier, was a very clever and very slick operator, and he had some formulation that he made her high with. I mean, maybe it had some laudanum, alcohol, whatever it had in it. She looked more bonny, was happier than she'd been forever. That turns out to be the so-called magic potion that they drop into Tanya's eyes. It's a metaphor for the love potion that Simier was known to purvey toward the queen, and which for months she would go to their room unattended, and either the Frenchmen, they were really a troublesome lot. When Oberon puts those drops into Tanya's eyes, whether she wakes, whether she sees a meddling monkey or a busy ape, she will fall madly in love with it. Well, Simier was her ape, and the Duc d'Alençon was once referred to as a little monkey. So, he was having fun mocking the queen's obsession with this French duke, and mocking the duke as bottom in the play itself. And so there's a beautiful allegory. Now, who's known about this for so long? Well, Eva Turner Clarke wrote about it back in 1928, early Oxfordian. She recognized right away. Percy Allen wrote about it way back then. But you won't find this story in any Shakespeare edition. Now, there was a scholar writing in the 1970s, a good woman named Marion Taylor. She wrote a book called Bottom Thou Art Translated, and she develops this whole theme beautifully about how the rustics in Midsummer Night's Dream represent Alençon's entourage and the French delegation, and all the metaphors and images that are in the play that mock his negotiations with the queen. So it's a good story. That particular narrative is available at the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website. They don't have to buy my book to learn about Midsummer Night's Dream and that exquisite, mocking, farcical political allegory mocking the queen. Now, you could not write that about Queen Elizabeth and get away with it unless you were so subtle and so well connected. And she loved the play so much because it reminded her of the craziness that she had gone through 10 years earlier with the whole Duke. So this was written probably a decade after that all went down. And so I could, it was a lot of fun writing that up and then recognizing that this is the kind of thing Aristophanes would do. He would mock the nobility and the power mongers, Socrates, the tyrants in Athens during his period, and he'd get away with it because of the Athenian democracy. You couldn't sue a playwright without just cause, and Aristophanes got off the hook every time they tried to go after him. So it had that Aristophanic quality about it. And so that's what I added to the story, that this may be Shakespeare's tip of the hat to the Aristophanic satire, that by mocking the powers that be in a humorous and yet not so damaging way, you can make a point about power politics and the sexual negotiations that go on. So it's quite a wonderful story when you see what's going on behind the scenes. But you won't find that story of the allegory in almost any Shakespeare edition, not that I know of. So this is the undiscovered country for some people. And when you get the backstory, why, gosh, you really understand the play so much better, and you're so much more amused by it. You can just see how the courtiers who knew the story would be dying, laughing, and rolling over in the aisles because the cleverness with which it's all done, and yet nobody's going to recognize that it's an allegory that makes fun of a living queen. You just don't get away with that.
Okay, and okay, you were just talking about the humor that a lot of the people would understand, and you do make the point about the Saturnian Celebrations is also going on. It's a recreation of the Greek festivities as well. So you're drawing parallels between the two different time periods. The Birds, not the Hitchcock movie, but you're creating a lot of parallels there with just the festive celebration. So that the comedy and fun of the play is all consistent with the Greek influence.
Well, Aristophanes was the one example that no other serious scholar had looked at as a potential Shakespeare source because his dramas were mostly topical. They were about what was going on in Athens at the time, and he raised a serious threat in the way of amusement to the powers that be. I mean, he mocked Socrates in the clouds and in the frogs. There are several plays in which he's commenting on other writers and philosophers right there on the streets of Athens. In fact, Aristophanes' play about that mocks Socrates is used as evidence against Socrates when he goes on trial 25 years later. So you have an impact, apparently. So that attracted my interest, because the thing about Midsummer Night's Dream, it is the only play in which magic is used to transform a character into an anthropomorphic kind of being. That Bottom is the only character in all of Shakespeare that undergoes kind of that fairy tale, evolution. Now, Caliban's kind of a hard thing to describe, but it doesn't happen as a magical moment in which he's transformed. Well, in Aristophanes The Birds, which is his finest drama, really an amazing narrative. Two Athenians are wandering around looking for the best place to live because Athens is intolerable. Everybody's suing everybody else. They're at constant war with Sparta. And these are all actual facts, So he's writing about the despair of the Athenians in search of a peaceful place. And I figured the birds see everywhere because they're flying above everything. So maybe they'll help direct them to the best place. Well, they end up in the land of the birds. And they suddenly are being threatened by this big bird who was once transformed from the King Tereus of the Procne and Progny story that is part of the Ovid's story. So there's a connection there. And then what happens is they sprout wings because they eat a special berry, and they become bird-like. And then take over, and then the birds triumph over the Olympians, and it's just one hysterical narrative after the next. But you see that it is you see transformation, physical transformation, and the dominance of birds. And in Midsummer Night's Dream, there's probably 15 different species mentioned. There's a lot of birds mentioned in Midsummer Night's Dream. So they have the birds on both sides, and you have this political narrative, and you have political narrative, and then you have transformed characters. So I kind of put those things together and made a stab at trying to find what is common with Aristophanes and Shakespeare. And you find festive comedy is exactly where they link up. And so that is, you hit it, the nail right on the head, Mark, looking at what is it that makes these things parallel. And who loved Aristophanes were the writers of Greek romance, including Heliodorus. And it was the translation of Heliodorus by Thomas Underdown, dedicated to the Earl of Oxford and sponsored by the Earl of Oxford, that changed theater life in London in the latter 20 years of the 16th century. I mean, Underdown's influence in creating plots that people used as romantic plots within, English drama during that time was fine. I mean, they just milked Heliodorus for narratives. So, those old Greek romances, stories, and, humor was part of the cultural underbasis upon which the Shakespeare corpus and other related plays in the English Renaissance were built. It goes back to the Greeks in so many different ways, both in comedy and in tragedy. And Mark, I want just to remind of your viewers one thing about the Earl of Oxford. It's very important to understand. The year he was 19, so he's entered university level studies. He's been at the Inns of Court for several years studying the law. He's got honorary degrees from Oxford and Cambridge. He's an acknowledged, real serious student of languages and history. And he gets dedications from Underdown and other people contemporaneous during that time. His uncle, Arthur Golding, who translated Ovid's Metamorphoses. They're all so deeply connected and in a small literary circle. But Underdown's book, was very, very powerfully influential. And, he got 30 different literary dedications during that time. He was the man behind the scenes, along with Elizabeth, along with William Cecil, Earl of Leicester, others who were sponsoring translations and theater companies and all this. But he had a boys' company, he had a men's company, he had a company of musicians. He apparently even had supported a company of acrobats, and he really was a spendthrift and went through a small fortune supporting the arts and travel, and he just burned it at both ends. And his father-in-law, William Cecil, did not approve of that kind of plan, and no wonder they wanted to suppress the works, or his name from the works. But he was during the 1580s on fire and was working on a variety of different projects and with so many different writers that were making a huge difference in that period of time. So to be the fountainhead of a whole new revolutionary approach to literature and history and theater is a pretty remarkable place to be. And Shakespeare's underappreciated as really a very wonderful way of doing it, with the Greek as the primary burning example that motivates him in so many important ways.
Yeah, this is just fascinating information, and we always come back to Midsummer Night's Dream, but just wanted to get into stick with the fantasy theme and talk a little bit about the famous statue scene from a Winter's Tale, and can you tell us a little bit about how the cover painting for your book is related to the play? And I thought you'd just kind of stick with the fantasy for a little bit, then we can get into some Macbeth as well. So the artist is going to have just a lot of really cool information presented by you. So okay,
all right, let's start with the Winter's Tale. And most of your viewers probably have never seen a production of the Winter's Tale. It doesn't get produced all that often, but it is sacred theater, and it is one of the romances. And the narrative is the King Leontes becomes paranoid and obsessed that his wife has been unfaithful to him, and throws her in prison, their beautiful son dies of a broken heart. He banishes the daughter who's sent off to die in Bohemia, but is rescued by the shepherds there, and then meets up with the prince. And of course, she's so beautiful and perfect. The prince falls in love with her, and then they end up 16 years later going back to Sicily, which is where King Leontes lived and where he condemned Hermione, and is presumed dead for that whole period of time, presumed dead. And he's done penance. He's actually, it shows deep remorse and truly Christian repentance on some level. The way I saw it depicted at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, you just saw him as like a monk-like shadow of his former self, so devastated by the consequences of his insanity during that paranoid period of his life. And temporary insanity and paranoia is a real disease. It really does happen to people. As a doctor, I've seen it happen and people recover from that. But he did recover and did his thing. And then finally the princess comes back, having been rescued and then brought with the prince who's the son of the man he thought was the illegitimate father of the daughter. And they're all brought back together. They go to the temple that Paulina has created to view a statue of the dead queen Hermione. Well, Paulina has been very clever and hidden her away for those 16 years and has her set up as a statue at the very end, an unmoving being. And it's the most strikingly conceived and profoundly penetrating moment in all of English literature, according to Wilson Knight, who was a great director and scholar, because they had this beautiful music playing. They played Pachelbel's Canon in D the year that I saw it. Just stunning, melancholy music that you go to honor this beautiful, virtuous queen who was falsely accused and died of a broken heart. And then she moves and offers a blessing on the daughter and is reunited with the king. And the audience was sobbing during that renewal sign when she came back to life. And it's a miraculous representation in Shakespeare like you never see in almost any other play. I mean, Pericles can come close on some level, but the statue scene, it used to be performed as a standalone scene through the late Victorian era, when people just loved it so much they wanted to see just the statue scene and then we'll watch the regular play. Okay, so it was a very, very popular thing. Well, what you see in the image is Hermione leaning on the pedestal. Hold that image up again, Mark, the cover, if you've got it there. Sure. And I can explain a little bit about what is in play here. So she's leaning on the pedestal. She's pulled back the veil. She's now emerging, but she's leaning on the pedestal, and you can't see them very clearly, but you see two circles, one dark and one light. The dark one shows a bas-relief of Hercules wrestling with death to bring Alcestis, the queen who died in the Greek myth, back to life. And then in the top panel, you see Alcestis reunited with the king. She was presumed dead in Euripides' play, Alcestis. The deal on the Alcestis was that the king, Admetus, his fate was up. He learned that he was going to die young. And so Apollo, who owed him a favor because he had protected Apollo during a time of Apollo's being exiled from Olympus, did him a favor and said, okay, if you can find somebody to substitute, the fates will accept the substitute and death will take it. But you just got to go find somebody to die for you. Well, he went to his parents, and of course they turned him down. They said, no, I'm not going to die for you. And no one else was willing to volunteer to die for the king except for the queen, Alcestis. And the reason she says is the idea that our children should be orphaned and that maybe an evil stepmother come along and undo them undoes me too much. I'm willing to die to prevent that so that they have a father. They have a king for a father. And I will give myself up to death. And she does it with such grace and dignity and beauty. And yet at the latter half of the play, Hercules shows up, doesn't know the queen has died, gets drunk, gambling, running around at a party. Finally, the servant, you know what's happening? Do you know why we're in grief here? The queen just died earlier today. Why are you being this way? What? Didn't know that. Let me go see what I can do. So he goes down and wrestles with death at the tomb and brings Alcestis back veiled, and then exposes her at the very end of the play. And it's a great rejoicing. It is the one example of a Greek romance, okay? And it was probably performed as one of what used to be called, or could be called, satyr plays, which are, shorter plays at the end of a tragic trilogy, kind of lighten the mood a little bit. So we don't know what the other plays were that appeared with the Alcestis, but it was so powerful. It was included among the rare 18 different plays of Euripides that we have. And it became very popular. She was mentioned in Plato's Symposium. She plays a role in Chaucer's Legends of Good Women. So the story of Alcestis continues with a literary tradition, and Shakespeare reinvents it with both the statue scene in The Winter's Tale and then also in the final scene with Hero and Claudio in Much Ado About Nothing. It has a powerful, dramatic background for both those two plays of Shakespeare. He loved Euripides. He loved this play. It gave him an opportunity to create a divine, really sacred moment of theatrical, power. The whole crowd would be sobbing, it happened several times in the theater that I attended. So, it is a classic example. And so to have that as the cover for my book is wonderful. And that's a portrait 1780 by Johann Zoffani. And it indicates that the theater company or whoever designed the portrait knew that The Winter's Tale was sourced from the Alcestis of Euripides. And yet, throughout the 20th century, nobody was going to write about that. So, there is conspiracy here, the conspiracy of denial of Greek sources in Shakespeare, and it's based primarily on the prejudice against them because these would require somebody who had connections with the library and had much greater language skills than we could probably surmise for the gentleman from Stratford-upon-Avon, who normally receives the credit for these marvelous works. They're far more elegant and integrated with Greek theatrical elements than have been generally recognized. And that includes both tragedies and comedies. The histories, they stand alone. They're historical pieces of maybe state-sponsored propaganda. Interestingly, about the histories, Holland's Head Chronicles, I think it was the 1587 edition that was considered Shakespeare's primary source for the history plays. It was edited by Arthur Golding and a man named Abraham Fleming. And Fleming was Oxford's secretary. He's been referred to as his amanuensis, somebody very close to him. So whether it's the histories, the tragedies, comedies, the literary connections that the Earl of Oxford has, his web is dense and thick and extends across both, contemporary history, Renaissance, medieval, and classical sources. And I've only been scratching the surface on this for the better part of 20 years, Mark. I've never doubted that this is a valuable story that adds something to my personal understanding and perhaps the understanding of some of my readers regarding the works and their origins and the magic that is on that stage. It comes from the deepest of drama roots.
Okay, so as we get into Macbeth, you get into some of the a little bit more like Friday the 13th aspects of like Elizabethan.
Listen, yeah. Thank you for bringing up Macbeth, because that's a part of how living theater can blow your mind. I was very fortunate in that living where I live in Southern Oregon, there's a very active lifelong learning program at Southern Oregon University, and the fabulous Hannon Library, where most of my research is done. I do some online work, but if there's a book I need, the Hannon Library will have, because they have over 7,000, 8,000 Shakespeare-related titles, plus journals and all sorts of resources. So, I was very fortunate. Well, I was taking this class, the lifelong learning, and we were doing a 10-week read of the Oresteia of Aeschylus, which is the only tragic trilogy we possess. These were trilogy competitions written all through the 5th century BC during the Athenian Golden Age, and yet of the literally thousands of plays that might have been available. We only have one complete trilogy, and it's the Oresteia of Aeschylus, which starts with the Agamemnon, which describes the return of Agamemnon after the Trojan War and his assassination by his wife in revenge for him having sacrificed their daughter to go to war, and her lover. And then you have the Libation Bearers, which is the middle play that is the trilogy, in which Orestes returns and is united with his sister Electra, and they work together along with his friend Pylades, and essentially in all the versions, whether it's Aeschylus or Sophocles, eventually they kill his mother. He kills his mother, and Aegisthus, her lover. And then the final play, and it ends with him showing the knives and the net he used, to kill his mother, which she used to kill his father. And then he sees the Furies with their snake heads, the snakes for head, they're like the Gorgons, and he runs. And the final play, the Eumenides, starts at the Oracle of Delphi, where he has taken refuge at the Temple of Apollo. And of course, the Furies have pursued him there, but Apollo put them all to sleep. And he tells him, you got to go to Athens, and there'll be a trial of your peers, and Athena will attend to this, and I will be your advocate, and we will see what happens at the end of this. So he goes off to Athens. He's purified the best that he could be, having killed his mother, and then stands trial at the Areopagus, which is where murder trials were actually held in Athens during Aeschylus's lifetime. So it is a remarkably topical story that has to do with the growth of the judicial system in democratic Athens. And there's a 12-man jury, and the jury splits, and Athena casts the deciding vote and exonerates him because he was doing what the god told him, and that she was guilty of, a bloody carnage by killing the father, and that these Furies should now become content that they have brought their man to trial, that they receive fair hearing, but no longer are they allowed to pursue this revenge. We offer you a place, a grove for your own, where our citizens will come and honor your energy, the furious energy of the earth. And so they accept that settlement. And so that is the end of the stories of Orestes. That's the Aeschylus version. Sophocles and Euripides have slightly other versions. Well, we were studying that in detail, 10 weeks to read it, several different translations. And then we saw Macbeth. And I was not alone in being stunned among our members of our class by all the parallels and images and characterization and in metaphor and in weirdness and in supernaturalism and birds that were the emphasis and prophecy and all the things that were the elements of the Oresteia were hauntingly there right behind what was going on in Macbeth. I was stunned. I went home and I wrote down, I think, a dozen different parallel ideas that I perceived and
dark
shared
power.
in the class. Yeah. I think I listed them in the book. So that was a direct experience of theater with enough knowledge of a Greek source that made it very stunning, spooky to see all those connections. And then you go look and find out who may have also shared that vision. And you find writers back in the 19th century in commentaries you can discover in this wonderful library that I have access to that made deep commentaries about the parallels between Aeschylus and Shakespeare, and how Macbeth is clearly the most classical of all the dramas, most Greek-like. And then you find a few other threads, and then you start tying these things together, and you realize you can create a pattern and make an argument, a more comprehensive argument, because you recognize some of these things, and you were fortunate enough to have in your forebrain the images and the ideas and all that were encased in the original Greek source. So I made an argument on that and extended it, and I believe It's one of the best, most original probably article I've written in that book there. So the chapter on Macbeth is due to a direct experience of theater, and then the obligation to write this up and to create something credible was there. And of course, that could take you many months.
Well, you meant, of course, like, the haunted houses and so everyone loves the ghosts, like Macbeth and Richard III. Those are really foreshadow of all the Poe and modern day Gothic movies, but you do have a very informative section about all the Greek literature has their ghosts as
yes,
well.
And
Maybe surely we'll get into ghosts and the medical stuff, hallucinations. But if you want to talk a little bit about the your chapter on the the subcategory, the haunted houses, I'm sure our
the house
fans.
speaks in the Macbeth. The Macbeth doth murder sleep. I mean, there are lines in which he perceives, he has an auditory hallucination that the very stones, and this is a very Greek concept, that there is a living essence within even inanimate objects like stones in a building, that the house will speak to us. And the Furies, of course, are portrayed as sitting on the roof of a building and causing rumblings within the building. And that's what awakens Clytemnestra in Aeschylus's libation bearers. So she's trying to get some sleep, and there's rumblings and voices in the night that disturb her so much she can't bear it. So she has, lights lit so that she could see at night. And so does Lady Macbeth need a light lit. So there is a deep, sort of anthropomorphic element to the inanimate world that is part of the Greek legends that are part of this. I mean, the Greeks thought sometimes a weapon would have its own memory, or that you could put an army of dead soldiers standing up and it would scare your enemy and they'd run off because they thought you had a huge army when most of your people weren't. So they had something in that. And of course, there's a ghost in Euripides' Hecuba, there's a ghost in Aeschylus's Persians that offers prophecy, tells us how Darius, the ghost of Darius comes up and said Xerxes, his son, who tried to conquer Athens, has failed miserably. He should never have done that, and made war against the Greeks. And so the 1,000,000-man army of Persians invading Athens, invading the Attica, and then the Peloponnese also, the Greeks, the Athenians and the Spartans combined forces drove them out. The Athenian navy defeated the Persian navy, and the Spartan army defeated the Persian army. So you had complete collapse of the Persian Empire in its attempts to extend to the west based on that. And that is the seed, as the beginning. That's in 490 and 480 are the two Persian invasions. And then from that moment on, the restoration of Athens, they burned Athens the first time, 490 BC, but they built it, and they built a Parthenon, and then they had this huge theater going, and then they've got the great philosophers and the great astronomers and scientists and historians, and the growth of Greek culture during the next 75, 80 years was phenomenal. And the only thing that really stopped it is because they went to war against Sparta, and after 30 years of continuous conflict, finally collapsed. And there was some remnants. Socrates was still on the streets, and Aristophanes was still running a few plays, but the great era of tragedy of creation was gone, and it collapsed. with the overextension of the Athenian Empire in its war with Sparta that was ended disastrously. So the same thing is going on in England during that same time, because you have this war with Spain that goes on for a very long time. It was almost 20 years, 15 years, I think, that war with Spain went on. After the assassination of Mary Queen of Scots, the Armada gets sent to try to depose, the Queen and reinstall a Catholic. And of course, Mary, the Queen of Scots, was their hope. And so when Elizabeth, people convicted her of treason, she's probably guilty of it, and beheaded her, then that was the beginning of a long, long war. Well, emerging, that's 1588, the Armada goes down. When does Shakespeare plays start being referenced? 1589. That's the first reference to a production of Hamlet that we have, a publication of 1588. In the early 1590s, you have the profusion of plays, the historical dramas that come out, and some of the comedies, and then through the 1590s, a huge profusion of quarto editions that are published of Shakespeare, and of course other playwrights as well. But Shakespeare is the one that we are paying attention to. And so there was an explosion of creativity in the aftermath of the defeat of the greatest invasion force ever to be confronted by the English Navy in history. There were other attempts at invasions, but they were all minor league compared to the first one. And so England, like Greece, survived the assault of a superior power, and that stimulated a cultural renaissance that was unprecedented. And maybe the sense of national unity was part of this, but I think if Earl of Oxford is Shakespeare, he was in the middle of it, and very quietly being the man, doing what he did. And why did he hide his identity? Okay, that's a decent question. And everybody has their own answers, whether they're mostly political or purely literary in interpretation. I do believe that poetic license goes with anonymity. And writing under a pseudonym, which I believe Shakespeare certainly was a pseudonym, allowed him to write things that he would not otherwise be able to get with as one of the ranking earls of the kingdom. And while he was acknowledged in his youth as the most gifted court poet and a writer of interludes and comedies, the best of the nobility writing these things, we don't have one thing other than a handful of poems attributed to him. And most of those are probably juvenilely written during his very youthful years. But then we have the sonnets. And if you're an Oxfordian, you look at the sonnets and you see the lamentation of a poet who's lost all his power, all his connections. And whether you interpret the sonnets as dedicated to a son or as dedicated to a young man you greatly admire, or a lover even, then you have different interpretations of the sonnets. But when you make it personal, when you understand the Earl of Oxford as the author, then the interpretive possibilities are blown wide open. And, there are a variety of opinions within the Oxfordian community on the meaning of the sonnets in particular, and how they reflect on his personal travails. But the plays themselves, they're spectacular and revolutionary, and there's nothing like it that's ever been written. And, when Oxford got his edition of Plato at the age of 19, so he got Chaucer and he got Plutarch and the French Plutarch, and then he got a Plato in folio, whether it was a Latin translation or just an original Greek edition. I can't tell you. We don't have that book, but we know from a book receipt he got it. And when he was reading those dialogues, the Symposium, which is my favorite of the dialogues. I mean, other people love the Apologia or this, the Republic and other more famous ones. But the Symposium is like an all-night drinking party with Socrates and Aristophanes and Alcibiades and all these characters that are the movers and shakers in Athenian culture. And at the very end of the night, he takes Aristophanes and Agathon aside, and Agathon won the triumph of the tragedies. And he said, guys, writing comedies is good, writing tragedies is good, but a great playwright could write both tragedy and comedy. And I can see the 19-year-old Earl of Oxford reading this, very creative, having written a number of poems and dabbling in dramatic literature, being deeply connected to Greek literature and the Greek romances. he was very familiar with these themes, and I could just imagine that lit up his imagination in ways that later on fed his soul and made him creative in a variety of ways that we've never seen any other poet or playwright come close.
Yeah, and you were talking a little bit about Edward de Vere, a nobleman, having to hide his identity, and in the haunted houses section of your book, you do have the quote, still cried, sleep no more to all the house. Glamis has murdered sleep, and therefore Cawdor shall sleep no more. Macbeth shall sleep no more. Well, yeah, those are just three of the names, three of Macbeth's identities. So there's, I don't know how much you can use that for evidence of, linking it to the authorship thing to de Vere, but that's some little periphery information, but it does fit.
Well, the other classical elements that are underlayment in Macbeth, besides the murder of an anointed king, in his own bed, and then the revenge by the son Malcolm coming back in the end. So the story of a murder of a king by one of his noblemen, and then the son coming back to reach revenge and be responsible for the death of the tragic hero. That's part of the story of the Aeschylus. But when you start looking at the idea of the houses being haunted, and in the Oresteia, there are rumblings within the house that are very disturbing, and voices that are hard to interpret. So you have parallel elements in that. You have the bird images in both those plays are almost identical, and they're always raptor birds. An owl attacked a falcon at the height of its. No, owls hunt on the ground. Okay, normally they hunt rodents and little birds and other small creatures on the ground. That's where the owls normally hunt. But this owl attacked a falcon at the height of the falcon before it did its dive. And so, supernatural, unnatural phenomenon are part of that story. The movement of the forest, that Macbeth misinterprets, Yep. The way he misinterprets the prophecy. And of course, the Weird Sisters are like the Greek trilogy. The Weird Sisters are totally built on the idea of the fates, of the Greek tradition. And of course, it incorporates, Celtic and, imagery as well, but you talk about the new Gorgon. I think Macduff mentions the new Gorgon. That's all part of that Greek imagery. But in the production that we saw at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, that was so spooky and so weird, when the supernatural big head beings came out of the stage floor, and the incantation of the witches, it was frightening. When they wrestled Banquo to the front of the stage and slashed his throat and the blood spurted out, all my hair stood up on end. I mean, it's standing up kind of right now, but that's artificial. What happened then was real. It was like I had an outpouring of adrenaline, So the possibilities within this play to evoke the deepest horror and imagination, and the slaughter of Macduff's children, the ruthlessness of Macbeth as he degrades himself into deeper and deeper places. And then, of course, the appearance of the revenging ghost. And the revenging ghost is a classical ghost. It's not the ghost of Christianity. Christian ghosts ask for prayers to get me through this, talk Catholic. We're talking Catholic now. Primarily, I don't know much about Catholic theology, but in purgatory, you get intercessory prayers from people who are still alive to help you on your way to get to heaven. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but the ghosts in Shakespeare, they're all classical ghosts. They're they're like brutal, they're not like, wishing, you give me a prayer. Well, Macbeth, Hamlet's father says, remember, revenge me, remember, don't forget, and he turns up again. Have you forgotten your mission? You're distracted by your mother. Stop it. Let her go do your job. So these are not ghosts that are gentle spirited ghosts that are begging for, prayers to help them on their way to the heavenly body.
So you're arguing that the ghosts are more like pre-Christian or
they are. Plato writes about eidolons. There's a number of words that describe the spirit place between death and where they go to the underworld, and that some souls kind of hang out. And then there's the idea of so-called Grateful Dead. Now, we're not talking Jerry Garcia and a bunch of jam music. We're talking here about the myth of the man who was saved by a ghost. He had a dream during a night on a trip to go get on a ship. And in his dream, a ghost comes to him and warns him that if he gets on the ship, he will drown. And so he doesn't get on the ship. And then the ship goes down. And he says, okay, I will honor this spirit that saved my life by giving me this prophetic dream. And so he was among the Grateful Dead that warned me about what might be coming down. Now, the warnings that Caesar gives, Brutus, if it goes to Caesar, and the warnings that Richard III's victims give him, and the parade of the future kings of Scotland that the witches, the weird sisters, provide for Macbeth are all very disturbing and very unsettling on the eve of the death of the tragic heroes. So you're looking at the use of ghostly images. Now, Shakespeare just peppers his plays with these kinds of elements that come out of the classical tradition. And it's not just Greeks, of course. Seneca's influence from the Roman tragedies is clearly there also. And I think is mostly appreciated because everybody accepts the fact that Latin sources would have been available to Shakespeare. There was a published collection of Seneca's 10 tragedies by a guy by the name of Newton. I think about 1585 or so, he collected the 10 tragedies, various translations. And incidentally, the translations were sponsored by Queen Elizabeth, William Cecil, the Earl of Leicester, and the Earl of Oxford. They were the most prolific sponsors of translations of the classics during that time. So the ferment was not just in creating a dramatic literature, but it was also providing the source materials, whether from original Latin sources or from Greek sources, particularly in the case of Underdown's translation of the Heliodorus, which is the basis upon which Greek romances were all built. The daughter gets lost and then returned to the father. These kind of stories that the Winter's Tale, Pericles, they all feed off of that idea of the deep romance in which, after a period of suffering, deliverance is still possible, and happiness at the end of the play can be completely fulfilling. It's not all the plays that give you that, but certainly the romances, Tempest, Pericles, Cymbeline, and The Winter's Tale, which are the 4 plays kind of classified as romances, all give you that uplift in the end, the resolution, the couple that wanted to be together is finally together, the king is healed, whatever it is, restored to the losses that he suffered for so many years.
But maybe we can do another quick sample of all the Gothic stuff. The viewers enjoy the paranormal stuff, but you do bring up the poison breaths from Greek literature. Connect that to Lady Macbeth, then that might be a nice segue into doing your career of hospital, working in the ER, being a doctor, medical doctor, and the kind of mix all that together, and then we can go into some other things. But I thought that might that subchapter, the poison,
the poison breast, of course.
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
Clytemnestra has so many possible comparisons with Lady Macbeth. But Lady Macbeth, in her opening soliloquy, basically says, turn my milk to gall, and I would pluck from my breast my suckling child and smash its head, where, had I sworn to do what you haven't done, that kind of thing. So her breast is poisoned. It is full of gall, and she would pluck the child from her breast and smash it and kill it for for the realization of her husband's ambition to be king. So, she's willing to go in ways that are very bad. Well, in The Libation Bearers, Clytemnestra is awakened from a dream. And the dream is this, that she's nursing a serpent, which happens to be an image for her son, okay? So she's nursing the son who's turned into a serpent and then bites her in the breast. And she is awakened by this very disturbing image. And then she does all these things to try to expiate and offer, sacrifices to the tomb of her husband. She realizes that she's had a prophetic dream and that the very son that she nursed with her own breast is likely to come back. And her fate is tied up with what his mission is, which is to, kill her. I mean, he's been told by the gods, if you don't make this right, if you don't kill the mother who killed your father, the king, the day he returned from triumphing, at the Trojan War, well, you have no courage. You're not a man. So he's been told by the god he has to do this. And so he's following a directive that matricide is not a moral act. In the Christian tradition, certainly it isn't. But in the classical tradition, they make some room for that. For instance, the reason that Clytemnestra wants to take revenge on Agamemnon is that he sacrificed their youngest daughter, Iphigenia, so that the war party could sail from to Attica, could sail to Troy. Otherwise, the winds were against them perpetually. The gods had chosen to go against them, and so they demanded the sacrifice of the daughter. That's what the Calchas, the seer, told him he needed to do. Well, in one story, of course, she is executed, and and that's one of Euripides' stories. But he tells another one where at the last second, she is whisked away by the goddess and taken to the island of Taurus, where she becomes the high priestess of the temple of Artemis. And then years later, her brother and his sidekick Pylades wash up on the shore, and then through a series of recognition scenes, she understands that he is her brother in exile also. And so they band together and sail on. And so she saves them from being executed by recognizing them. So there's a second story written by the same playwright that undoes the original myth in some regards, saying, well, there's another aspect. And a lot of the Greek myths have several different narratives, whether your source is Apollodorus or Diodorus, your idea of what comprises the 11th labor of Hercules, and whether it is Hercules that goes get those apples of the Hesperides, or whether he goes and relieves Atlas, who then goes and gets the apples of the Hesperides. So there's two versions of the 11th labor of Hercules, and it comes down to two different traditions, depending on whether you think Atlas did it or whether Hercules held up the earth while Atlas did that, and then came back, and then Hercules gets the apples and takes them to Athena, which is what his duty is. So when you see that Shakespeare puts both those stories woven into different plays, both those narratives of Hercules and Atlas, you realize his depth of knowledge of the various sources of Greek myth, whether they were from Apollodorus or Diodorus or Herodotus or wherever those stories came from. He had covered the spectrum, and he was fascinated by some of these stories. He has over, I think, 35 allusions to the various labors and adventures of Hercules in the canon. And I took a special interest in this because of the density of allusions to Hercules in several of the plays, including Midsummer Night's Dream, Love's Labour's Lost, and Much Ado About Nothing. And then you see that the author was referring to different aspects of the myth of Hercules in ways that are subtle and expansive, so it's he wasn't confused. He just was wider read than most current scholars who say, oh no, that's not what happened. He actually relieved Atlas. Hercules wasn't there. Well, he was there in one of the versions. So there you go. Okay. So I do think that the poisoned breast is critical to linking Clytemnestra, going back to that point, linking Clytemnestra with Lady Macbeth. And that's part of what that binds them. The other thing that binds them is the damned spot. Lady Macbeth saying, out, damn spot, out, damn spot. Okay, she obsesses and washes her hands. She cannot wash off the blood of royal assassination. Well, depending on your translation of the Oresteia, the chorus says to Clytemnestra, after she comes out, she's got blood smeared on her, and she's got the net and the sword that she used to assassinate her husband. And they said, that blood smear will taint you. That will ruin you. There's nothing that will cleanse that blood smear. And so it doesn't it's not exactly out, damn spot, but the implication of the taint of sacred blood that ruins everything about your life thereafter is implied in the text. Claudius says as much himself in his speeches about how I can't, all the waters of the world cannot cleanse these hands, he says, So that image of the Greek, all the waters of the world will not cleanse the hands of someone who commits royal assassination. That is active and alive within the works of Shakespeare in both the great northern tragedies, Hamlet and Macbeth. So that's what kind of combines them. Now, you did ask about the medical knowledge in Shakespeare, and I do have a separate chapter on that in my book. And while it's not specifically about one given Greek source, it indicates that the author was very familiar with classical medicine and Renaissance medicine, and that he knew about Paracelsus and the teachings of Paracelsus, as well as the teachings of Galen. The corpus is clustered with hundreds of medical allusions, shows him very much aware of the subtleties of neurologic diseases, including seizure disorder. He describes a seizure in several other people, including Julius Caesar. He describes sexual diseases in ways that are outstandingly clinically accurate. I mean, in Timon of Athens and in Thersites' lines describing, the effects of syphilis, tertiary syphilis in Troilus and Cressida, both of those are bitter satiric commentaries with accurate clinical descriptions of sexually transmitted diseases. So Shakespeare was familiar with medical literature, including the literature of the Neoplatonists and the literature of Hippocrates, the stories of Asclepius, and some of the poetics of the Greek tradition that refer to some of the medical material that came forward. But European, or I should say English Galenic medicine was mired in the mud of a 2,000-year-old misconception about what causes illness. Now, trauma-wise, Hippocrates was great, but his idea of the humors and Galen's expansion on that is, popular and has been popular ever since. I mean, you have blood, you have mucus, you have black bile, you have, air. You have all these elements and fluids within the bodies that are balancing each other, and they're out of balance, and then you give remedies to balance them. It is a fantasy that works. Now, the placebo effect must have been very powerful, because most people, when they get past their childhood, recover from infectious diseases, viral diseases, not bacterial diseases necessarily like the plague, but from viral disease. They tend to recover. So no matter what remedy you're using, you're probably going to get better, okay? So the whole medical scientific revolution was still 100 years away, and we only had William Harvey's description of the circulation of blood in the immediate aftermath of the Shakespeare period. It was the early 17th century that first began to be recognized. So the microbe theory didn't exist, although some Greek philosophers certainly imagined an atomic world with micro elements, but the knowledge of medicine that's in the Shakespeare canon has attracted a number of authors to write books about it. I was fortunate when I wanted to give a talk on Shakespeare's medical knowledge to a group of ER docs at a conference that I was invited to. I had access to like 5 or 6 different books in the library locally. So I could go in loaded for bear and point out that Shakespeare's medical intelligence was about as good as any physician writing in that period of time. And the Earl of Oxford was connected. He had, I think, 3 different medical books dedicated to him. The Queen's surgeon, George Baker, and John Hester, the leading, alchemist of that was making Paracelsus remedies, in his little pharmacy. He was very famous. His first book was dedicated to the Earl of Oxford. So Oxford was right there. And his wife was a practicing empiric medical practitioner. We have documentation of that. And of course, his mother-in-law was also a practicing empiric practitioner. And the library at Cecil House on the Strand, we don't have all the inventory, but there were hundreds of medical books in there, including the complete works of Galen and Hippocrates. So the Earl of Oxford was raised up in a household that had an obsession with medical intelligence. They had the works of Paracelsus. They were very aware of the coming revolution in the alchemy that was transforming medical management. The alchemists and the Paracelsians were much closer to being accepted by the surgeons who actually provided bedside care. The physicians were locked up in their little books, commenting on things from a distance. They didn't even do physical exams. They would look at your urine. They would test your urine. They wouldn't even do a palpation and do a normal physical exam. Their whole education was based on a theory that is utterly, unpredictably and probably rather a fantasy. So,
yeah, and you do start your Shakespeare's medicine chapter with, for 150 years, physicians and Shakespeare scholars have written commendably about the comprehensive medical knowledge reflected in the Shakespeare canon. During this time, a remarkable number of rare medical texts have been identified as Shakespearean sources, including works on Hippocrates, anatomy, surgery, alchemy, infectious disease, and psychology. And
right.
We can get into in the your subchapter on psychiatry.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so some of the characters are dealing with depression, insanity, the hallucinations. We've kind of already touched on it with Lady Macbeth and Washing, dementia, and King Lear. That's actually really fascinating. But you do go on to say, in the 1580s, Oxford, the Earl of Oxford, lived at Fisher's Folly, which was located opposite Bethlehem Hospital, London's primary institution for treating the insane.
Yes.
Okay, so besides family members being medical practitioners, Vere can just observe different illnesses and related behaviors. Just throw out like the washing of hands, like that might be like a OCD kind of behavior, but I'm sure someone of the nobility could ask a doctor. It's like, hey, what's up with this guy?
Well, the physicians who were trained exclusively at Oxford and Cambridge were book knowledgeable about the Galenic medicine, and they really resented the Paracelsians coming in. And the Paracelsians were embraced primarily by the barber surgeons initially, and then gradually these schools got integrated over a period of time. But the actual bedside care was oftentimes done by surgeons and not by physicians. And when the plague would come to London, and there were a series of plagues during the late 16th century and early 17th century that killed, huge swaths of the population, all the physicians left London. The trained, board-certified physicians went with their rich families to the countryside to get out of London. And it was the surgeons that ran the hospitals and took care of the people who had, plague, sexually transmitted diseases, those kinds of things. So you found a kind of a split in the medical community back then. But I do think that the surgeons were more open to actual clinical diagnosis, physical examination, and looking at remedies that are like chemical treatment, the chemical treatment of things. And they would use things like arsenic to get rid of syphilis and those kinds of things. So there were some toxic treatments that were aggressively against some of the diseases that they had to confront. Now, I think it was Sigmund Freud who was told by Dr. Charcot, who was a famous French neurologist, and that Freud was initially a neurologist before he really branched into psychiatry. He was told, if you want to understand neurology and human psyche, read Shakespeare. I mean, there's so much there. So, it's been recognized. Now, I was very excited to see that the first book on Shakespeare's medical knowledge was written by a psychiatrist, John Charles Bucknell, who was the chief medical officer at the psychiatric hospital in Exeter, in Devonshire. And he dedicated his book to Lord Campbell, the Chancellor, Lord Campbell, the Lord Chancellor, who was he would be like the Attorney General in the United States. He was a leading lawyer in all of England, and he'd written a book the previous year on Shakespeare's legal acquirement. So Bucknell wanted to point out that, well, no doubt Shakespeare's law is quite remarkable and noteworthy, but let me show you what he's got in the way of medical intelligence also. There's nobody that's writing as clearly and as concisely and as descriptively with accuracy as Shakespeare. And that was confirmed 100 years later by another physician, a Scottish physician, who looked at all the plays and dated the plays and the sources and the medical intelligence within them. And he said, well, a lot of people would say that it was Shakespeare's daughter's marriage to Dr. Hall, and his daughter Susanna married Dr. Hall a little bit after 1600, I think, not long after Dr. Hall moved to Stratford-upon-Avon, and they lived together in Shakespeare's New Place house for 10 years. And they said, well, could Dr. Hall have been the source of all this medical intelligence and witty, descriptions? Well, Dr. Simpson, the Scottish physician, determined no. Almost all the medical images that are important in the play that really show Shakespeare's breadth of medical knowledge were written for plays that were actually published or attributed before the 1580s. So, I mean, before Dr. Hall moved to town, excuse me, before the 1500. So it was just a remarkable way of viewing it and saying, well, we still don't know how he got all this information. So I would say the medical knowledge is an important leverage that suggests that the author was very familiar with a broad range of medical literature, including anatomy. In I believe it's 12th Night, Holofernes refers to the pia mater that fed by fluid in the pia mater by the ventricle of memory. Now, how many of your listeners know what the pia mater is? I mean, it's the thinnest cell-thick lining around the brain and spinal cord, okay? And the ventricle refers to the ventricle of memory is probably the fourth ventricle, which is at the base of the brain. So how many of you know that the brain consists of ventricles that have these hollow spaces in which spinal fluid is acquired. So you have you have to look at the anatomy books and say, well, where did he get that idea of pia mater and the ventricle of memory and all that? Well, it turns out Thomas Vickery wrote an anatomy at that time. He was a popular surgeon and a well-known surgeon and a prolific writer, and he describes that. So you see that there are actually direct literary sources that are rare and reflect a very subtle knowledge of something that's really quite remarkable and very specific. So he gives a great forensic description of a nobleman that was died by strangulation. It's like a CSI investigation description of all the things that were going on and how his face was purple and there was scratch marks and then his hair was all, he describes perfectly what it would look like if you were a victim of that type of assault, that somebody had shown him that, whatever it was. So we have a hard time aligning some of that subtle and rather expansive medical knowledge. Oh, there's a picture of New Place. Yeah. So, they lived together for 10 years, and the Dr. Hall never mentioned his very famous father-in-law with this huge store of medical knowledge in any of his personal notes. He did refer to Michael Drayton, a local poet from Warwickshire, and lauded his poetry. But he never mentioned the poetry written by his father-in-law with whose household he was living in for a better part of a decade. So there are missing pieces in the story. You would fully expect that Dr. Hall, in his notations, would have at least mentioned. His notes were recorded in Latin and later translated to English and published. His wife, Susan of Shakespeare, could not recognize his handwriting, couldn't attest that the handwriting in these notebooks was actually his. So she was technically illiterate. Judith signed with a mark. What are the chances the man that writes characters like Helena and Cleopatra and Portia, and Rosalind can not educate his daughter so that they can at least read the works that he's created? So the disconnect between the biography and the illiteracy of the biography, suggesting the biography, and the incredible characters that he creates, largely the women who are so brilliant and so intelligent and so capable within Shakespeare, like no other author writing contemporaneously. And the Greek example of the very strong women coming out of that classical tradition was probably the source of his inspiration to describe. Now, there were contemporaneous women, who he's, perhaps including as referred to in the plays, no doubt, allegorically, but in terms of the root of the feeling of these strong-willed and determined women, and it comes really out of the Greek source as much as it comes out of any other literature that I can think of. So it's kind of thrilling to think that you've gotten behind the author's mask a little bit from time to time. And when you've been where I've been for the better part of 20 years, every now and then you have a sense of, it's almost revelatory that you see that he was clearly influenced by these passages.
Yeah, and I just think we could almost do another 2-hour show just on the Shakespeare's medicine chapter. I just thought that was really a lot of fun reading the like CSI. Right. Have the example of strangulation, and then we could also get into the what the Malmsey but wine from Richard III, and the Little
poisoning
Prince.
in Hamlet.
Yeah. So there's just a lot of stuff that in that whole chapter that we have covered on some other shows, and it's really a fascinating topics that you bring up. And learning some of this from an actual real doctor gives it more credence. So that was just that section is well worth getting the book.
Well, Mark, I have to confess that up until my fascination with Shakespeare, I wasn't particularly interested in the history of medicine. I knew some of the narratives and some of the characters that played important roles, and Fleming and a few others that were really extraordinary, and how we evolved with that knowledge. But I was obsessed with what was going on today. I needed to know about the advances in imaging, CTs and MRIs and PET scans and things like that were invented during my practice period. So I paid no attention whatsoever to the history of medicine until Shakespeare, and then the invitation to speak on it. And then I realized, oh my goodness, there is a lot of good material here, and it suggests an author that was very, very knowledgeable. And his wife, Anne Cecil, who I believe has remarkable parallels with Helena, the empiric practitioner who heals the king's fistula in All's Well That Ends Well, then earns the right to name her husband, and then names Bertram, who then runs off to Italy. The parallels between Helena and Anne Cecil are remarkable, but I was provided with some material during my studies of this by a fellow Oxfordian named Ron Hess, and others have confirmed Ron's sources on this, but that the Countess of Oxford, Anne Cecil de Vere, who he married when she was 15 years old, and she died at the age of 33 after bearing him 3 daughters and 2 other pregnancies that resulted in early childhood or infant death. That she was an empiric medical practitioner and successfully treating people within the neighborhood where the family lived. And her mother was that way too. So there was a breeding ground, and the parallels between Helena and Anne Cecil and the Earl of Oxford and what I would call the anti-hero Bertram, who only at the very end of the play acknowledges Helena as his lawfully wedded wife. That is an ugly self-portrait of the Earl of Oxford, very self-conscious. And I'm going to be speaking on that at our conference in New Haven in September on the themes within All's Well That Ends Well that parallels the relationship between the Earl of Oxford and his wife Anne and Bertram and Helena from that play. Many people have written about that, and I'm going to be summarizing most of the work that's already been done. But I do have my own little perspective on that. And looking at the medical practice of his wife, I can see that he was keen to know more about this. And when she passed away in 1588, about a year after bearing him his youngest daughter, the earliest possible considered date which this play might have been produced, and we don't have any evidence, any history of productions before the 18th century, was in 1588. She died in 1589 and 1590. There are some topical allusions within the play that dates it to that time. It has to do with Paroli's use of various scarves and his attire, and that credible dating of that play in the early 1590s or late 1580s would make it an apology by the Earl of Oxford to Anne's family, to the Cecil family, for her being mistreated during the 5-year estrangement in which he rejected her and their first daughter. So I see that play as being highly autobiographical, but the hook that really gets me is that she was a practicing empiric practitioner like her mother, and that he was fascinated by the healing arts, and that Helena's magical capacities and ability to heal the king's fistula when all the other physicians had failed is part of a way of honoring his wife, who died young and was unfortunately mistreated during a certain period in which the young Oxford, in the way of Bertram, rejected her and wouldn't be with her and said the child wasn't his, but the child was his. So that's at least my take on the whole story, Mark. So that's coming forth, but it has to do with his wife's medical practice and what I can learn as much as I can about that.
Well, there's throughout Midsummer Night's Dream. You have, references, let's just say to wheat and hawthorn buds, and just the little western flower. Just throughout the whole book, there's all kinds of names of plants. Some I've heard some people say, "Well, it's that's actually." Maybe you said that on one of the earlier appearances, but the names of the flowers in the Midsummer Night's Dream aren't just dandelion and cactus that just randomly chosen. There's a reason for them.
Shakespeare was an incredibly gifted naturalist.
Yeah,
I mean, the number of plants, trees, and shrubs and flowers that he describes within the works. Botanical Shakespeare is a book by my friend Garrett Quealy, Geritquealy, Garrett Quealy. And I believe the title of her beautifully illustrated book is Botanical Shakespeare. It can be bought.
Okay, yeah, I kind of have a feeling she's going to be getting annoyed with an email from me about, we need you on the show soon.
Well, she's a quiet and discreet person. I mean, Helen Mirren, I think, wrote a dedication to it. Judi Dench raved about it. Neither of them would be pleased to participate with someone who might have doubts about the attribution. So Garrett's work is really beautifully focused on the profusion of botanical images. And of course, we've already talked about the birds, and then you have navigation terminology, legal terminology, medical terminology. The breadth of knowledge of this Renaissance man was quite remarkable. And plants were a big part of it. And he was raised in the Cecil house, and Cecil's personal gardener was John Gerard, who wrote the definitive book on plants of that era. So it's like it's all right there with him. From the time he was a very young man growing up, and he was surrounded by the leaders in the scientific and medical, legal, and cultural revolution that was going on.
If there's a reference to a flower, there's a reason for it. It's not just and I think when we spoke or last fall about that, it really is a fascinating subject. So we're gonna have to get your friend on to continue the conversation.
There are other people who are interested in the botany and Shakespeare too. I'm not sure whether you'll find her interested in doing that. She's deeply connected to serious scholarship in this area. So, but your listeners should go out and buy her book, Botanical Shakespeare. It's a valuable asset if you love plants and you love to see what Shakespeare has done with the images of plants. I mean, the sonnets are peppered with floristic images. Winter's Tale and even Hamlet. Ophelia describes a whole series of things, of plants that she's, and here's the thing about Ophelia, and I only recognized it fairly recently after hearing readings just last year, that when she is described how her death occurred by Queen Gertrude, she describes how she was up on the branch of a tree and wearing a crownet of weeds, at which time the limb collapsed and she ended up in the brook and then drowned. The crownet of weeds. The crownet is exactly the description of the headpiece that the Countess of Oxford would be wearing in formal occasions. She doesn't have a crown; she has a crownet, and that's what she was wearing when she died. She was wearing. So Ophelia's connection to Anne Cecil de Vere is also deep and resonant, and of course it also, now you can date Hamlet. Or the first version of Hamlet was probably 1589, And so if you see Hamlet is at least in part a memorial piece for his wife as Ophelia, and that All's Well That Ends Well also has an apology and an acknowledgement of her brilliance as a healer and her perseverance as a wife. I think both those plays kind of could be tied together a little bit. The dating is way off, of course, traditional attribution. Both of those plays are dated to the early 16th century. 17th century, excuse me. So you have to argue the dates, but there is a reference to an early Hamlet. So
okay, we're getting towards the end of the
show.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, 2 hours gone like that. Thank you for inviting me.
And how do people get your book? And I'm going to have to check in on someone here in a second. That's what the phone calls were interrupted.
It is Shakespeare's Greater Greek. That's the title. Or you can go to Earl Showerman on Amazon. We printed it through the Amazon Kindle Direct Publishing. It's only available in paperback. And I encourage your readers to take a dive on that. If you're interested in Greek theater, if you're interested in Shakespeare, there's a deeper connection than you possibly might have realized before. And I think you will find it an enjoyable read, especially for people who are loving the idea that there might be some reason to doubt the traditional narrative, and that this is one part of that mosaic, creating a counter argument to the traditional way of interpreting Shakespeare. Singing his wood notes wild. No, he was in the library. I'm sorry. He was reading deeply. So, Mark, thank you so much again. Thank Barbara for the honor and the privilege of being with you and your audience today. It's a great idea for me to have this opportunity. It's like I don't get this way to express myself very often. So thanks again.
This was a fantastic evening. Thanks, Earl. And we will see everyone. I think I'll be back in a couple weeks. So thank you, everyone. And have a great week. We'll see you soon. Thank you, Earl, and all the Shakespeare fans out there.